Welcome to episode 3 of Climate, Trees, and Legacy. I'm Connie Barlow. The topic of this third episode is Joshua Tree, specifically lessons of Joshua Tree. Now, we've been going along in this video blog series thus far, following the route of the Great March for Climate Action here, climatemarch.org. And right now, the marchers are heading towards Wickenburg, Arizona, a little bit west of where Michael and I are here north of Phoenix, where they'll be camping tonight and where we will visit them tomorrow. Now, they've just been walking through the Mojave Desert of eastern California and into Arizona. The iconic tree of the Mojave Desert is, of course, the Joshua Tree. So in this series, we're going to take a look not so much for figuring out what needs to be done with Joshua Tree as the plant zones of climate change accelerates, moving northward faster than this tree can move. It's one of the slowest moving trees that we have here in the USA. And I'll talk more about why that's so as this program goes on. But really taking a look at how we can understand better for all trees in the decades ahead and all forest plants of what we might be required to do to ensure that the forests in America remain healthy, that the plants can move northward to shift in time with climate zones change as we need to adapt both the ecologies around us as well as our cities and our civilization. At the same time as we are trying to mitigate, that is to lessen the impacts that will happen in the future owing to concerted efforts to reduce and ultimately eliminate our placement of more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere owing to widespread and voluminous burning of fossil fuels. So episode 3, Lessons of Joshua Tree, follows on the heels of Lessons of Torrey Pine, which is what I used as the focal tree species while I was at the coast of Southern California north of LA. Now, before I get into the details of what I've learned on this journey and show you a lot of photographs and videos of Joshua Tree landscapes and actual trees that I've taken en route, I'd like to mention that just a few days ago, earlier this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 2, issued a new report titled Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Now, this follows on the heels of last September when Working Group 1 issued a new report, an updated report on the physical impacts, that is, what's really going on with climate change and what can be expected. So this working group is really dealing with what the best estimates of Working Group 1 are, and taking a look at, well, what does this mean for the choices that we make as individuals, as countries, and hopefully as a human species working together globally. And that means that how do we make choices based not on somebody coming up with some 100% proof positive of how climate is going to change, but how do we evaluate risks? In the same way, how do we evaluate risks in deciding on fire insurance when we buy a home? Or on auto insurance when we start driving a car. It's the same kind of thing. It's risks that matter, not whether we will be in an accident, not whether are we sure that our house is going to burn down, but these are the risks. So the thing I'd like to point out on this new report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability is that even though it's a multi-volume, huge report, there's a 44-page summary for policymakers. And I read through the whole thing, and amazingly enough, 2 paragraphs deal not only with assisted migration, but there's a chart in there that shows specifically in order to ensure that we don't have biodiversity loss, even more mass extinction of species than we've been undergoing just through habitat loss and so forth. There's a chart in there that shows that of all the kinds of creatures that there are, trees are the most vulnerable to extinction owing to the rapidity of climate change, the shifting north in the northern hemisphere of plant zones. So take a look at this figure. You'll see a column on the left, And it shows a little picture of a tree there. Next to it is a picture of a leaf of just a herbaceous plant. And you'll see that all of the other columns are taller. That means that they have a capacity to track shifting climates more through time than trees do. And I talked about this in the last episode on Torrey pine, that when you have a generation time, that's usually about 30 years before one generation of trees is able to create seeds and then have them move northward or in any direction. If you've got a generation time of 30 years, then unless you have some capacity at each generation to get your kids out of the family home and send them north miles, you're going to be in trouble. Plants cannot move, and trees reproduce at a much slower rate than non-woody plants do. So this figure shows that we are right in this series, Climate, Trees, and Legacy, to focus on forest trees, that they will be the most vulnerable. And of course, they are the distinguishing feature of what makes a forest vertical rather than a pretty much horizontal flatland of a grassland. So forests, trees, climate, and what legacy we leave to future generations, the health of the forests and the species that will be in them. That's the topic of this series. Now, as I mentioned at the outset, each time that I learn something new about a species I've already covered, I'll bring it up in later episodes. And while Michael and I were driving from the Los Angeles area eastward through the Mojave Desert over to Las Vegas, where he had several speaking engagements, and then we came down into the Phoenix area, I got a chance to actually see a street in Las Vegas called Torrey Pines Drive. I took a video of a street near there. I wasn't able to get across the street, but I took a video of what could be some Torrey pines. I'm not sure that they are or not. Normally, it's an Afghan pine from the Caucasus Mountains that seems to be the landscaping pine tree there in Las Vegas. But in the possibility that there really are some Torrey pines that have been planted in Las Vegas, I'd like to make the distinction that that is not an assisted migration. And here's the reason why. People in San Diego or Los Angeles who are planting Torrey pines, watering them, taking care of them, those trees are close enough to the natural habitat of Torrey pine that if civilization were to vanish, or the trees were to have their seeds escape into some uninhabited areas, those trees could potentially grow there. The climate is right for them. And in the case of Southern California, that means substantial fog during the dry season. The fog is crucial for providing them with enough water. Las Vegas doesn't have fog. So any of the Torrey pines that might have been planted in Las Vegas as a beautiful landscaping tree, there is no way, with or without civilization, that those trees are going to continue to exist, that they have the capacity to become a tree of the natural landscapes of the desert in the Las Vegas area. So again, assisted migration is not just taking a tree and planting it anywhere and taking care of it. But no, it's moving it into a place where potentially that tree will be able to reproduce and be able to continue spreading its population as the climate shifts. Now, as we begin Lesson 3 on Joshua Tree, I'd like to mention that this is probably the most complex of any of the trees we're going to be covering on this west to east journey through all the regions of the United States, the southern United States and the central United States, taking a look at a single tree species and understanding what climate shift may mean for it and what role management by humans will have to change. Now, Joshua Tree is the most complex, partly because it has the most difficulties of distribution of any of the trees we're likely to cover. And the reason for that is it's been recognized for quite a while that not only does Joshua Tree take a long time to reproduce in between generations, but it seems to have lost its primary seed disperser. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But first, I'd like to give you an introduction to Joshua Tree, how disjunct its range is. That is, you'll find a clump of them doing very well in one location, and then you'll go up over a pass and particularly down into a flat valley, and it's just all creosote bush there, salt flats, and you lose it. Then you go up on the other side of basin and range habitat, and there on a slope you start seeing them again. This is not a continuous forest. These are distinct populations. So first I'm going to take you through a little journey of photos and video, starting in Palmdale, California, which is northeast of LA. This is the first place going from LA to Las Vegas, where I saw right along the road some Joshua trees. And so I took some pictures there, and we're going to be then going to Las Vegas and then starting down again into the Phoenix area and taking a look at where Joshua Tree occurs there. Now, one of the interesting things you're going to see there is that there are places where the Mojave Desert intersects with the Sonoran, and a few very interesting places where Joshua Tree and the saguaro cactus actually are growing in the same locale. So let's take a look at that journey. Our Joshua Tree road trip from Los Angeles to Las Vegas on March 20th, 2014 finds the first Joshua Tree just on the southeast suburbs part of Palmdale. Now you can tell here that these suburbs are encroaching on a wild field of Joshua Tree. This is the tallest species of genus Yucca. Joshua Tree is Yucca brevifolia, and here we see it looking pretty good at 2,700 feet elevation. Heading east out of Palmdale on Route 138, we come to a remote outpost, Little Rock, where the California Aqueduct from the Sierra watersheds east of San Francisco crosses under the road on its north-south journey, continuing on to Los Angeles. Looking south from the aqueduct, we see the San Gabriel Mountains. Pasadena is right on the other side of those mountains. Notice what also is on the horizon. Those are Joshua trees. This is quite a woodland for Joshua trees at this part of California. Heading east, the road climbs gently to 3,200 feet, where we see a wilder section of Joshua trees. I was very fortunate to stop here because this particular tree has something on it that will become important later on in this program. This way we can get a close-up look inside of the flowers. Now this is really important because all species of yucca apparently have a symbiotic relationship with particular moths. This one has a symbiotic relationship with a very small moth, which I'll show you later in the program. But right now, just take a look at the inner of the flowers. In the lower left, you can see inside that particular flower, you can see the male parts, the anthers, inside along the petals. And then rising right out of the center is the female part, the stigma. And amazingly enough, it's the female moth, after she mates, who carries some pollen in her mouth, tentacles along the side of her mouth, deposits them inside the center of that stigma, and then lays, with her ovipositor, lays some eggs also inside of that stigma. That's an amazing relationship between a plant and an insect. Both are absolutely dependent on their partner species, as I'll discuss later. Okay, so that was Joshua Tree in the Palmdale area. It wasn't until the mountain pass just north of Mojave National Preserve that I was able to see abundant Joshua trees again. But what was in the low areas in between? Well, a lot of creosote bush. Creosote bush there was just beginning to flower. So here I show a close-up of a creosote bush that I took later on further to the south, where you can see the buds, the flowers, and also the fluffy seeds starting to form. For this program, I want to highlight creosote bush because from a deep time perspective, it's important to know that creosote bush wasn't in North America until about 11,000 years ago. Paleoecologists surmise that this South American species arrived on the muddy feet of some migrating bird. It took root here, and certainly in the beginning it would have been an invasive species. You can see how successful it is here. Creosote bush is not only well adapted here, but it poisons the soil. So in its immediate surrounds, other plants are unable to grow. We're going to talk a little bit more later on in the program about the key concept of what is native and how does native species change from a deep time perspective, both in the past and importantly in the future as climate continues to change. Now, I'm sure there's some Joshua trees on the slopes of those mountains, but here at this elevation, the only thing we see in the yucca family is what I call tall yucca, Yucca shittigera. Now, these photographs were taken at about the 2,000-foot elevation, and this is too low for Joshua tree. I'd like to pause in our video journey and show you here the distinction in size between the Joshua tree leaf, which is the lowest one here, the smallest one with my little finger here. That's about the standard size of a Joshua tree leaf. Up above it here, this is a tall yucca leaf. It's about the normal size, and then I specifically looked for one of the longest leaves I could find of the tall yucca. You get to the point where you can pretty easily see when it's just those two yuccas that you're trying to distinguish, as we had here on my journey, just these two yuccas, the Joshua tree and the tall yucca. You get pretty well that you can distinguish a young Joshua tree that hasn't yet branched because its leaves are so small from the longer leaves of the tall yucca. So now let's go back to the video journey. Recapping thus far, we've been exploring the road area looking for Joshua trees from Palmdale, California to just north of Mojave National Preserve. Now, I don't have any photographs or videos of the high pass north of Mojave National Preserve, but know that from about 3,500 feet on up to the top of the pass, 4,500 feet, there were lots of Joshua trees, including babies. Multi-age stands are a good indication that the plant species, in this case Joshua tree, is pretty happy with its climate. Again, this is pretty far north where we are in Joshua Range. My husband and I stayed for a day and a half in Las Vegas, and then on March 22nd we started heading south towards Phoenix. Didn't see any Joshua trees, again, because the road is going through the lowest areas. I'm sure there were Joshua trees along the sides. But we didn't see any Joshua trees along the road until we got to what's called the Joshua Forest Parkway, here indicated between the two yellow stars. Now here's a picture of the very first Joshua tree we saw along the parkway, the northernmost part. And the amazing thing is we not only saw a Joshua tree here, but we saw a saguaro. Now neither one is very populous here. Here's another view of the saguaro continuing to pan towards the west and into the south. And you'll see there are a few more Joshua trees here, but they're not abundant. Continuing south for 5 miles to milepost 123, take a look far in the distance to the east. There's a video of a stream valley, elevation there about 2,000 feet, and there you can see a Joshua tree near a juniper. Now in the foreground there's lots of creosote bush, and there's a Joshua tree right along the road itself. Now about 10 miles further to the south, there's a lava flow that blocked the road, a basalt flow, and the road had to be carved through it. This is a great chance to see saguaro because saguaro really needs something sturdy to put its roots into. It can't just be on alluvium in the flats. Now heading 30 miles even farther to the south, milepost 162, elevation about 2,000 feet, this is the second and last place along this road journey that we're going to see an actual overlap between the saguaro and the Joshua tree. 8 miles farther south at milepost 170 and just under 3,000 feet elevation, we come to the high point of Joshua Forest Parkway on our road trip. Here they're spectacular. Now notice this one in the foreground. It is actually beginning to develop a trunk. It really looks like a tree, not a yucca anymore. Truly, Yucca brevifolia becomes a tree when it gets mature and it's healthy. Here's a close-up of how the bark looks on an older Joshua tree. In times gone by, some Joshua trees became truly immense. But here's the biggest one that I saw on my journey. Let's plot the locations you've just seen along my road trip against a range map of where Joshua Tree is located today. The yellow stars show the Joshua Tree Parkway, the places where I took photographs. There we see Palmdale at the beginning of the journey, and of course the pass north of Mojave National Preserve. So I hope that video journey has given you a sense of the ecology today and the range of habitats in which you'll find Joshua Tree, how well it's doing in the different habitats, the associated plants, and then gotten a chance to see where the saguaros and the Joshua Tree overlap. Now, where I am, just north of Phoenix, of course, we have no Joshua trees here. We're really in saguaro country. I'll show you a couple pictures from right around here where I'm living of saguaros, palo verde, barrel cactus, creosote bush, ocotillo in bloom, just gorgeous ocotillo in bloom. But all of these are around the place here where we're staying with some friends north of Phoenix and Scottsdale area. This is the Sonoran Desert. Now, some people do have Joshua tree as a landscaping tree in their yard, and I'll show you a picture right now of that happening. Now again, because the moth is so important and so utterly dependent on Joshua tree for its own life cycle, it would be very unusual if any of these landscape trees actually ever did produce viable seeds and even produce any fruit. So what's going on here with landscaping trees is certainly not an example of assisted migration, although I think it's a question as to whether a Joshua tree could live here or not. They tend to need colder temperatures than saguaros. They actually need a freeze in order to get encouraged to produce blooms and then ultimately fruit. Now, the interesting thing is that paleoecologists and others who are studying Joshua tree have a sense that right now the northern range of Joshua tree might be lagging quite far behind where climate has already shifted since the end of the Pleistocene, about 12,000 years ago. And let me show you a little map here where Ken Cole, the researcher Ken Cole at Northern Arizona University, based on paleo evidence of rodent middens when they could date some of the shrubs that had been brought in and used by the rodents for their nests. Also, very importantly, there was a viable disperser 11,000 years ago that went extinct, that for the previous millions of years had been a major disperser of Joshua tree because we could see its leaves, its fruit, and its seeds in its dung. So here's the map that shows in hatched surface that the Joshua tree, back about 12,000 years ago, actually was living down in northern Mexico. And you can see the dark, solid gray areas on the map. This is where it's known to exist now. and the black triangles are some of the fossil paleo dung deposits or rodent deposits that confirm that Joshua Tree was there at a particular time during the Pleistocene and very early in the Holocene, before the ground sloth went extinct. Now, Ken Cole, in his 2011 paper, was published in Ecological Applications Journal. The title is Past and Ongoing Shifts in Joshua Tree Distribution Support Future Modeled Range Contraction. Okay, short story there is Joshua Tree is going to be in trouble as climate keeps changing. More than that, the modeling done in here just assumes that Joshua Tree right now, the northernmost extent of it, is at the northernmost capacity of its physiological ability to live right now, as climate is right now. And yet most researchers think that because we haven't had the Shasta ground sloth for about 13,000 years, 11 to 13,000 years, it's been extinct. Joshua Tree really hasn't moved north at all, and yet the climate has shifted. So what happened about 13,000 years ago is that the Joshua Tree lost its southernmost range, and what the projections are is that unless humans come to the rescue, it's going to continue to lose range and simply have a smaller and smaller range going up to a little bit around Las Vegas, a little bit north of there, and then over eastward into a bit of Utah and northern Arizona. And it'll simply lose Joshua Tree National Park and some of the other areas where we can find it today. So let's take a look at Ken Cole's range map of where he's projecting in 60 to 90 years using the climate models that were available back in 2010, 2011, where Joshua Tree is likely to wink out, that means go extinct, where it's living right now. And those are the red patches. The red patches are where you can find Joshua Tree today, but 60 to 90 years from now, they'll be gone. Certainly their reproduction is already slowing down. The mature trees have the capacity to linger on even when the climate becomes unwelcoming for their young. So they'll be around for a while, but they will no longer be adding young trees to their populations. The green are the areas where Joshua Tree does not exist today and yet possibly could exist 60 to 90 years from now. And yet what will need to happen will be assisted migration. The estimate is that probably over the course of about a decade or so, you shouldn't expect a Joshua Tree to go any farther than about 20 meters or so. And so it's just not going to keep pace with what is very likely to be somewhere between 2/3 and 4 miles every decade. Plants will need to move on the flats, and in certain areas, probably the Southwest, will need to move faster as well because of the drought coming in, not just the warming, but also the drought. So there you have it. That's what the future holds for Joshua Tree. What do you think we should do? How long do you think we should just draw maps before we start experimenting, finding out by taking seeds north, planting them, and just finding out where's Joshua Tree capable of living now? I'm not talking about people's yards. I'm not talking about botanical gardens. I'm talking about the desert. Where north in Utah, in Nevada, in northern Arizona, where might Joshua Tree be able to start growing now such that 60, 90 years from now they'll still be able to reproduce as climate warms? Seems to me that we should be doing that experiment now. Now, given the fact that Joshua Tree was incapable of moving north during the whole Holocene 12,000 years ago because Shasta ground sloth was gone, it wasn't being dispersed then, and that it just lost its southern range, it's quite possible that there really aren't any useful warm adaptations down in the population in Joshua Tree National Park. That is, that there may not be anything special gained by taking seeds from those trees, from that population or any other very southern population that'll be winking out soon, and moving them north. It's quite possible that all the Joshua trees, no matter where we find them now, have pretty much the same climatic capacities, in which case we don't have to worry about them going extinct or losing vital capacities by letting the southern populations wink out. I don't know. I view it as a choice to try to minimize the risk of that happening by simply starting assisted migration now. I certainly view it as important to test out where is the limit of the northern range right now. Make whatever estimates you want about how climate's going to change in the future. But right now, let's find out where Joshua Tree can happily live and grow. Now, one of the things that I've learned just dealing with Joshua Tree that makes a very big distinction between forests of the eastern United States and forests of the western United States is that in the east, where I've been doing some work, so long as you protect the seeds that you've planted from deer browsing in places where you don't have enough hunters or you don't have enough carnivores keeping the deer populations down, you can pretty much guess that if you've planted them in a good spot, let's say a recent tree fall so they can get a lot of sun, that they'll be able to grow. That's because moisture is usually not a problem there. But it is in the arid mountain west and the deserts of the Sonoran and the Mojave. You might have a decade, you might have 2 decades go by before the fruits release the seeds in a year in which they can germinate and then adequately put down enough root so that it can weather the next drought period. So that means that an assisted migration doesn't require just 1 year, but let's say it may be over the course of 10 years that someone goes out responsibly in an area where it's not interfering with any other plants and spreading seeds each year. So that's an experiment that I recommend. I don't see any risks to it. I don't see why it should cost the federal government or the national science organizations any money. I don't see any reason why citizen naturalists or an Audubon group couldn't take it up on their own to undertake this process. I think it's something we can do now. It won't be anything I'm involved with because I'm only involved with an eastern species. But I do encourage others to go back to the first episode in this series where I introduced the concept of leaf-a-legacy and how you might want to read the scientific literature, assess where Joshua Tree is growing now, where it's healthy now, what its associated plants are, what soil types it needs, what slope it works best on, and so forth. And pick an area where you and your associates will commit over the next 10, 20 years to plant Joshua Tree seeds every year and monitor them and see how they do. That's something that can be done now with very little risk. Recognize, of course, that if you do establish a viable population in some disjunct outpost further north in Nevada or Utah or up higher on a mountain slope in northern Arizona, that ultimately, once the trees get to the point where they're about ready to start producing flowers, that you're going to have to help the moths find their way to that isolated new population. That in itself will require some effort to be able to do that, because my understanding is that the moths lay their eggs in the fruits, or actually in the ovary of the flowers. The caterpillars develop, feed on some of the seeds. If there's too many caterpillars and they're eating too many of the seeds, that Joshua Tree is smart. It will abort that particular fruit. So the moth can't overexploit its host. The Joshua Tree and the yucca moth each have to support one another. But to be able to actually find a fruit that's got some caterpillars in it And then when the fruit's ripe, but before the caterpillars emerge to then go down and do pupate down in the ground beneath the Joshua tree, to move that fruit to your new population so that the caterpillars can emerge, pupate on the ground underneath your trees, and ultimately emerge and serve your new population. So it's a much more difficult, complex thing to achieve, but certainly just seeing whether Joshua tree is capable of establishing, living, and producing blooms far to the north of its current range will be a very important addition to what science can thus far tell us about the needs of Joshua tree in a shifting climate. So in comparison here, I'd like to show you a couple pictures I took of plants that do have capsules. I'm not sure what this one is. I just filmed it last week when Michael was speaking at a church, and I was outside taking pictures of some of the plants in the landscape and wild in the desert nearby. And I've actually got some seeds of it right here. Here are the capsules. Let me see if I shake it, whether some seeds will come out. Oh yeah, there goes one. Most of them already jiggled out in the plastic bag I was carrying them in. Here you can see them. These are the typical shape of lily family yucca type plants, have this sort of a seed. Now I also took some other pictures. These are non-native. I'm not sure where they come from. I've seen them before. Take a look at this video camera picture of this very, very stiff pod that ultimately does open and keeps opening, and the seeds drop. And frankly, I don't know who disperses them, why they do this, but you can see that just like the previous plant, this one has no fleshy. There's nothing here that a megaherbivore would want to put in its mouth and swallow the whole pod. You basically you're a rodent or a bird, and you wait for the seeds to fall out. So here's an example of it. Right here, you can see how it's begun to open. And let's see if some seeds will fall out. Oop, there goes one. Whoa, there goes a lot more. These are quite large. So I would presume that these are edible by rodents. Rodents are able to eat a lot of seeds that we find poisonous, okay? So this would be adapted probably for some kind of a rodent. There's also this kind of a tree that makes a very, very stiff pod. Here's a video of the tree. And I picked one of the pods here. You can see it. It has an opening here. Yeah, there you can see it. I don't know if I can crack it open. Oh, okay, there it is. All right, I've just cracked it open. What do we see there? I don't know. Let's take a look. Oh my gosh, isn't this interesting? Okay. These are plumes. These are plumes, wispy plumes, okay? So it opens, and obviously a plumed seed is wind dispersed there. So the pod just protects the seed while it's developing. So one technical term I'd like to introduce here, and that's something that is very important for understanding whether a particular fruit is looking for an animal to eat the whole thing, swallow it, and poop out the seeds whole and viable rather than crunching the seeds. Rodents are seed predators. They'll kill the seeds. They eat the seeds. It's only if they die or they forget scatter hoard. Where the seeds can then germinate. But the megaherbivores, boy, you want those in. They might damage a few seeds, but some of them will pass out into the poop. And so the distinction here is dehiscent. This is dehiscent. It opens, it dehisces, and the seeds drop out. This is dehiscent. This, of course, is dehiscent, okay? These are capsules that dehisce, seeds drop out. What the Joshua tree is and what some of the tall yuccas are as well is indehiscent. That is, they never open, not on their own. They would ultimately dry out, but it'd be like, you sort of wait for an apple to dry out in the sun, and then maybe you can get in there and get the seeds out. It's not designed to open up and make its seeds available to the wind or a rodent. It's designed to attract a large animal that will swallow the fruit and poop out viable seeds, such as a Shasta ground sloth, such as a tall camel that's also extinct, perhaps a mastodon or a mammoth as well. In the case of our Joshua tree, they're fleshy. They never open. I'm going to show you a picture now. This is 1 year after these fruits began to develop. Nobody has taken them off the tree. Even the rodents that are capable of scampering up into the tree and opening up those have only gotten a little bit. Generally, the rodents have to wait for the pods to simply fall to the ground, and then they start destroying them. I was able to find a few on the ground. I have a picture actually of this one I took. This one, yeah. But unfortunately, the rodents had gotten all the seeds that were viable, and of course you'll always find in something like this, the few of the seeds have fed caterpillars during their development, and so there will always be some compartments here that should have seeds and don't. But anyway, I have no idea what a Joshua tree seed looks like. I've never been able to touch one myself because the rodents have gotten them all. I've got another set of pictures that I want to show you because this is one of the high points of my experience as a science writer, getting to know and work with Paul S. Martin. Now, he died about 4 years ago. He was one of the great Pleistocene ecologists. And through Paul, I actually got onto the topic of writing my last book, Ghosts of Evolution. And it's all about the missing megafauna that went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene and what that meant for plants left stranded with nobody to distribute their fruit. We already saw a little bit of that in the previous episode where I showed you some pictures about cherimoya and the kind of megaherbivores that are extinct now in South America that probably co-evolved with the tree. But anyway, when I was visiting Paul a number of years ago, he had and allowed me to hold an actual dung ball, a fossil dung ball more than 10,000 years old of a Shasta ground sloth. Now, this dung ball was found in a cave in Arizona. It's been dated. I don't recall at the time what the date was, but it was just fascinating to see how fibrous it is. Shasta ground sloths are hindgut processors like horses are. Hindgut processors tend to eat a lot of very coarse vegetation and get a little bit of protein and carbohydrates out of everything they eat, but not a whole heck of a lot, so they have to eat a lot. Elephants and rhinoceros are that way too. But you can see how unevenly processed it is. There's a lot of pure fibers, and if you take a look here where a pen is pointing, you can see a seed that could be a yucca seed. To me, it looks more like a datura seed, but I'm not that familiar with yucca seeds, so take a look there. Now, on that same trip, I happened to be there at a time when the tall yucca plants had already bloomed and fully produced their fruit, where I could actually pluck a fruit of a tall yucca, a very close relative of the Joshua tree. The blooms look very similar to me. The fruit is very similar. I cut this open and you can see how fleshy it is. My understanding is that some of the Native Americans of the Southwest processed the fruit and valued it as an important part of their diet. So it's not just Shasta ground sloths that were eating this, but humans with proper processing are able to eat it too. But you can see how there's a lot of extra material there that you wouldn't expect the plant to produce if it didn't have to. So what are the lessons of Joshua Tree? Well, the particular ones associated with this, of course, are, again, the importance of beginning to check out what the northernmost extent of today's current range may be for any tree species that for one reason or another has been left behind. In this case, left behind after the extinction about 13,000 years ago of its primary dispersal agent. That is the creature that was moving its seeds for it, the Shasta ground sloth. The thing that applies more generally, and in fact there are really two lessons here, one of which we've already learned from Torrey pine, and that's that people get possessive about their trees. I knew that from my experience with Torreya taxifolia, Florida Torreya. If its known habitat is a single state, then by golly, the people who love that plant are going to really resist admitting that maybe the time is past for it to be a Florida species and its time has moved on for it to be a Southern Appalachian species. Well, the same thing is going to happen with Joshua Tree National Park. I mean, if the Mojave Preserve, which has a lot of Joshua trees in it, had been made into Joshua Tree National Park, instead of that area to the farthest south part of the Joshua Tree Range, there wouldn't be as much of an urgency to the question about climate change. But what's going to happen to Joshua Tree Park when it loses its Joshua trees? I mean, the very first thing it's going to lose is you will stop seeing baby Joshua trees unless they've been nurtured and planted by the staff at the park, which they're already doing. They're already taking seeds, planting them in their nursery with the intent on moving them back into the park. But you know what? That's a wonderful effort for in the decades ahead in case those genotypes might have some special adaptations, and then those seeds, those seedlings, could be moved north, far beyond the borders of Joshua Tree National Park. And Joshua Tree National Park would just become a memory of the way things used to be. So that's one lesson, the possessiveness of people, for good and ill, fully understandable. The second thing, though, and this one's a bit more difficult because this applies to all species and all of us who consider ourselves watchful of ecological needs and who care about other life forms, not just our human civilization, who care about biodiversity. We have the underlying value, the notion, the assumption that there is such a thing as native range, that we can know what it is, that it was probably what was here in 1491, just before Columbus came over and therefore before the first European invaders came into the Americas. That's what we call native range. We don't need to make native range the number one value, the assumed we must work within the confines of native range. If we continue to hold that as the number one value, it's increasingly going to come into conflict with the overarching value of species preservation. Keep as much biodiversity as possible, keep the populations going. It's going to come into conflict with that. It already has with the tree I work with, the Florida Torreya, which we've moved up to North Carolina. Native habitat in this climate regime, we say is the Southern Appalachians, and Corny O'Brien Native Garden in the Waynesville area, Junaluska area of western North Carolina obviously agrees. They call themselves a native garden, and yet they're our most successful plot for assisted migration of Torreya taxifolia. Take a look at this picture of some of the best examples we have of how the seedlings that we moved in 2008 from little pots, how well they're growing there. This is a native plant garden. All the plants in here that are welcomed are thought to be native to North Carolina. So here the recognition is that from a deep time perspective, a paleo perspective, at this climate regime, Torreya taxifolia truly is native to the Southern Appalachians. So the question becomes, Joshua tree. Where is it native right now at this climate regime? We know it hasn't kept up with the movement of plant zones north. Where is it native to? Where will it be native to 60 years from now? How should we help it to get there? In each of the previous 2 episodes, I've always recommended a book. In fact, I've held up a book. So I'll do that here. I highly recommend this book, E.C. Pellew, After the Ice Age, The Return of Life to Glaciated North America. Now, this book was recommended to me initially by Paul Martin. Paul, incidentally, wrote the foreword to my Ghosts of Evolution book, which was published in 2001, as it's really an elaboration of a key paper in evolutionary ecology that he co-wrote with Dan Janzen, which was published in Science Journal in 1982. And that's where they inaugurated the idea of ecological anachronisms. That is, fruits like the Joshua tree fruit that co-evolved with a dispersal agent, a creature, an animal, co-evolved with it, and that animal is gone. That animal has become a ghost. So the fruit itself is anachronistic. It harks back to another time, and it's not really fully well prepared to survive in this world for millennia to come. And so what do we do about it? So that's an understanding that Paul gave me, and that became the topic of my last book. But while I was working with him, he said, Connie, you've really got to read this book. And so I got a copy and I read it. It's beautifully written. If you think native range is sacrosanct and that all biodiversity interactions and management concerns have to take place, number one, within the confines of what we think is native range, you will not finish that book with this same false assumption. This is an eye-opener. You will gain what I like to call deep time eyes as a result of it. And deep time eyes are what Paul Martin gave me. Now, this book was initially published by the University of Chicago Press in 1991, so it's been around for a while, but it's still highly recommended. It's just a wonderful, easy-to-read overview with a lot of pictures in it for understanding how both plants and animals moved back north after the glaciers began to melt, about 18,000 to 8,000 years ago in North America. And I'd specifically like you to take a look at the figure on page 264. Here's the caption. Many animals, all the survivors, managed to adapt to the changes that accompanied disappearance of the ice sheets. Some responded by altering their geographic ranges. A good example is provided by 4 small mammals that currently inhabit markedly different habitats. Okay, so now look at these on the figure itself. The smoky shrew of mature eastern deciduous forests. The 13-line ground squirrel of the prairies. The heather vole of the boreal forest. The boreal forest is in Canada and Alaska just before the tundra. And the Ungava lemming of the tundra itself. The caption continues. Nowadays, their ranges do not overlap, but fossils of all 4 species dating back from 11,000 years before present have been found together in a cave in Pennsylvania. There is no way of knowing how extensive their shared range was then. Okay, think about that. A forest shrew, a prairie ground squirrel, and a boreal vole, along with a lemming from the tundra where there aren't any trees at all of them were cohabiting an area in which their bones were all found in a cave in Pennsylvania 11,000 years ago. What this means is that during the height of the ice, when there was so much less land area available for creatures to live on, a lot of them ended up living with one another in a way that we don't even see now. what we need to remember is that in a lot of cases, the ecological interactions can adjust and have adjusted over time. We don't need to be overly fearful of north-south migrations and human-assisted migration of plants endemic and native to our continent. So long as we stay eastern plants in the east and western plants in the west and just move them north-south carefully, north-south, we're not going to be doing anything different from what they were able to do on their own during previous waxing and waning of the ice ages, okay? And this figure should show that to you. Okay, it seems like I always end the science part of this with whatever human developments I come across that give us some indication of how we are trying to anticipate climate change, what we're doing for moving into an era of reduced water capacity in the West and so forth. And it so happens that on the route that Michael and I had to drive in order to get from the LA area to Las Vegas is the biggest solar generating facility anywhere in the world. Now, I had no idea that it even existed, but we were coming over the edge of the hill and starting to come down into a valley north of the Mojave Preserve, this really dry valley, very one of these areas that is landlocked. There is no external river source heading out of the valley. It's just a flat evaporative zone. And we're coming over that hill and I say, oh my gosh, what is that? So take a look at this video. All of what you see there on the flats are parabolic mirrors. They're designed to capture the sun and then reflect and focus the sun back on any of those 3 tall towers that then heat up the liquid in those towers to such an extent that it's the same as, say, burning coal or fossil fuels in order to raise heat, in order to then run the turbines. So this particular plant is called the Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System. It's the biggest in the world. It has 170,000 heliostat mirrors, and it just opened in mid-February. Very controversial because we're in an era now where, quote, renewable energy is not necessarily green energy. In terms of solar in particular, most people are advocating, rather than sinking all this capital and all these materials into a single spot and then having to distribute the electricity elsewhere, the best thing to do is to really go with distributed solar power. That is solar panels or passive solar heat of just a blackened capsule in order to capture the sun, in order to heat water, not generate electricity. But all of these things that individual buildings, individual houses can do. So it's very controversial. It's also making it difficult for the entire land area there to not only be able to support desert tortoises, but apparently the mirrors are attractive for insects who think they might be water, birds that think it might be water, waterfowl migrating through and they get zapped by the power of the heat coming off of those reflective and they just burn up in the instant, there. Very controversial. The Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System, these are very interesting times. I also took pictures of the California Aqueduct that we passed over just east of Palmdale. So there are actually Joshua trees right in this area where I was taking the picture. I didn't take a picture of the Central Arizona project. It's the most elaborate aqueduct project in the USA. I've seen it while we've been driving around, and the one thing that I've got to say, I'm from Michigan, okay? I'm used to rivers. I'm used to taking rivers for granted, and then they go out into these Great Lakes, right? I mean, water is not a big deal in Michigan. I look at the water in these aqueducts, and I look around at all these buildings, all these golf courses, and then all this agricultural land. Look at the photographs I took of all the agriculture going on in what's called Gila Bend, where the Gila River has just passed out of Phoenix. Obviously, there's no flow there except the effluent, what's already been used by Phoenix coming out, and it will serve the countryside there and then be pulled out again by more agriculture. But when you look down at all the agriculture, all the urban development, and you see the water coming in through these aqueducts, there's just a disconnect there. How does this happen? A couple weeks ago, I saw that there was a blog of the 10 best cities for climate change, that will have the least problems with adapting to climate change. My hometown of Detroit, Michigan, okay, I agree, it's bankrupt, it's got real problems right now, I wouldn't want to be living there. But Detroit and Cleveland are near the top of the list of the 10 best in the USA for climate change. You know what's at the top of the list for worst? Phoenix. It's even worse than Miami. Phoenix. And I wasn't aware of this, but there's a kind of a symbiosis that you have between the moth and the Joshua tree. You got the same thing going on with the water source and the electricity, okay? You need electricity to pump the water coming from the Colorado River, Havasu Lake by the Havasu Dam there, out of the Colorado River into the Phoenix area, and then from there down to Tucson. You've got like 14 passes you have to go up and over in order to get the water all the way down to Tucson. That requires an enormous amount of electricity, about 1/4 of the electrical output of the big Navajo coal plant for electrical generation. 1/4 of that electricity to pump the water. Now you also need water to cool the electrical generation at the coal plant and to provide the steam for running the turbines there, okay? So you need the water in order to run the electricity, and apparently quite a bit of Phoenix's electricity comes from water spilling through the dams along the Colorado River and running the water turbines themselves from the gravity flow down. So Phoenix's electricity, which it's going to need more of, as climate change demands more air conditioning in the summer. People will die without air conditioning. More electricity at a time when we have less water, less electrical generation. What is this going to mean? What is this going to mean for the Sun Belt of the United States? Now, I always conclude each episode of Climate, Trees, and Legacy with a homework assignment, and thus far it's always been videos. So for this week, I would like to recommend a report that came out 2 weeks before the IPCC report. This one is the most prestigious and largest scientific society in the world. It's called the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Its members are all scientists. Many of them are Nobel laureates. And this is also the society that publishes the preeminent science journal in the world. It's the one that covers not a particular science topic, but all disciplines, the top papers it publishes in it. It's called, quite simply, Science Journal. Now, this group took a very unusual action. March 14th, they issued their own report, and it was called simply What We Know. That is, what we know about climate change. A short, extremely well-written report, putting it all in terms that people can understand. And just like the IPCC report, the emphasis now is on risk. It's on making choices, not based on what the most likely climate change may be, but on the full spectrum of likely as well as risks of damaging tipping points. That is, what are the risks of waiting and doing very little or nothing, and then one of these things happens, like permafrost starts melting and methane going up and warming goes out through the roof. I mean, what happens in these kinds of things? And so they're helping Americans and people throughout the world understand risks in the same way that we deal with risks in our own lives. I have to have health insurance. I've never needed it. I've always been 100% healthy. I'm 62 years old. I have health insurance, okay? I have car insurance. I don't have a home. I don't have fire insurance. But it's not because we think this is going to happen, but there are risks we are not willing to pay the consequences for if the untoward happens. And so right now, that's what the AAAS and the IPCC are doing, is educating us about climate risk. I think the AAAS has done a really excellent job. They've got not only a text, but I highly recommend their series of 8 videos. I recommend that you start off watching the first one called Consensus Sense. It's about 8 minutes long. Most of these are about 8 minutes long or so. And then my favorite interviews of the 6 interviews with scientists were Marshall Shepard and Alan I. Leshner. Those were my favorites. So again, I suggest watch all 8 if you can. Certainly watch the first episode called Consensus Sense, and then a couple of the interviews that may interest you. So this is Connie Barlow, signing off from Climate, Trees, and Legacy, north of Phoenix, Arizona, in the Sonoran Desert.